This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Complete your staining project with Pittsburgh Paints and Stains, now at Menards. Stain in one coat with Ultra Advanced Semi-Transparent Stain. It's a stain and sealant in one that can be applied to damp wood and on hot, sunny days, allowing you to clean and stain your deck in one day. Save big money on Pittsburgh Paints and Stains and head into Menards to get your staining project started today.
Save big money at Menards. Mr. Let's
With your host, Andrew Donaldson. This is Heard Tell.
Welcome back to Heard Tell. Okay, here's a fun one. Twitter buddy for a long time. They put out some polling. I had a question about it. He said, hey, you got a question about it? Let's talk about it. I said, do you want better? Come on the show. We'll talk about it. Jacob Perry, if you don't know him, he's been in politics for 20 years, inside them, outside them, analyzing them. He's now with Center Street PAC. How are you, buddy? Good to see you.
I'm good, brother. Thanks for having me on.
All right, the one that got everybody's attention, and we'll go through the rest of the polling data because you've been a political guy for a long time, especially Florida, because you know that race inside and out. We'll talk about that in a minute. The one that got my attention was the Arizona Senate polling race. Now, obviously, This is a big ticket race. A lot of people paying attention to it. The Polling USA poll that y'all did with conjunction with Center Street. Kelly 55, Masters 35. Governor race, Hobbs 53, Kerry Lake 39. And all I said, I wasn't even being critical. I just said that doesn't feel right. And I use feel on purpose. That doesn't feel right. Now, you've done politics for a long way. You know my way of thinking. That's a 49-49 state last election. Those are both Trump-adjacent candidates. Both are endorsed by Trump. So to think that they're going to be 14 and 9 points off what Trump did, that just doesn't feel right. Tell me what we're missing here that your number's a little different.
So I'm gonna issue a caveat, and I'm gonna start off by saying we do all of our own polling. So we don't outsource it to a polling firm. This is all literally internal. Our data guy is Dr. Kurt Jetta, who is the guy who invented consumer data aggregation. I actually explain to people that, if you go to your local supermarket and you see the stuff that's a BOGO item, Kurt's firm is actually the one that tells people what to do. So because we're not a polling firm, we don't do horse race polling. And this is what I always have to try to explain to people. The data that we gather and that we analyze is for our internal use as far as targeting and which races we're going to pursue and how we're going to, write the advertising, the messaging we're going to use, the mediums we're going to, put the advertising on. For example, I don't know, a few weeks ago, we did a pretty significant six-figure buy in Ohio. And that advertising was intended to target females between 40 and 55, I believe, right? Kind of unaffiliated or kind of unsure or whatever. That was a pretty significant six-figure buy, but it was based on the data that we have that is the most movable segment in that race, right? So long caveat aside, what I'm going to tell you is our polling has been very consistent in terms of, and they brand themselves as ultra MAGA, right? So the ultra MAGA versus a traditional Republican candidate are two very different things. And what we have seen in Ohio, Pennsylvania, Arizona, to some extent, Georgia, which is another one that we just released. Those are candidates that are pretty extreme. Those are candidates who, are, anti-immigrant. They're anti, they all believe that the 2020 election was stolen. They all sort of poo-poo the January 6th insurrection. And I would contrast that with a Marco Rubio, who is a more traditional Republican and who is actually has a pretty solid lead on Val Demings. So in Arizona, you have Blake Masters, who is maybe the most extreme candidate of all of them, the most extreme views, the most ultra MAGA of all of them, who was running against a legit American hero, by the way. An actual, you and I are old enough to remember, like, astronauts are pretty cool dudes. And they're the kind of guys that are walking down the street that you look up and go, holy crap, that's an astronaut. So I think it's a combination of things. I think it's Masters is, I'm going to respectfully say, a borderline white nationalist. And maybe not borderline, but based on his statements and things that he's on record, he's pretty extreme. But then you've got Mark Kelly, who is has an extremely, frankly, remarkably high favorability rating in Arizona. So it's kind of a combination of the two things. What I always say to everybody is, in 30 years or so working in politics, every election takes place in a vacuum. So what happened 2 years ago, 4 years ago, you have to take that in context of what was going on 2 years ago and 4 years ago. And what you're seeing now in this particular context of this cycle is a lot of extremist candidates who have very high unfavorability ratings.
Yeah. And to be clear, I think both of those people are unfit for office, just to be frank about it. The other part of the Kelly thing that people don't talk about, but I hear it every time I bring it up talking to people behind the scenes, is he's been just an absolute money machine. He's one of the biggest fundraisings in the entire Democratic Party, not just in the Senate.
Yeah.
He's printing money. So
Yes.
when you have and I'm going to lump Masters and Lake here together because they basically are a ticket for all practical purposes out there. They're running together, campaigning together. I think they're both unfit for office, but it is what it is. Is the story here from what you're seeing? Because again, you admit you're looking at the data differently than what a pollster is in the horse race, and that has its pros and cons. Is what we're seeing here, big picture wise, just for the average person without getting into the weeds of the data, that when you try to out-Trump Trump himself and you're not named Trump, that ceiling, that shoot people on Fifth Avenue number, whatever you want to call it, that number starts going down the more you go into that territory. And that's what you're starting to see in some of these Senate races that frankly shouldn't be close, looking at you, J.D. Vance in Ohio.
Right.
And the Republicans are struggling. Is that the lesson here that you're taking away from it? Because that kind of seems how it feels.
Yeah, and I think, again, the fact that, and we're not involved, at least at the moment, in the Florida Senate race, but we're tracking it as a way to sort of buttress our results, right? So we can compare and contrast this theory of the ultra MAGA versus the more mainstream Republican. And again, it's Florida, I get it. But you're right. I mean, in an ordinary year, and I think this is where some of the controversy came from. In an ordinary year, JD, the Republican candidate in Ohio should be up 8 or 9 points, right? Like we're not pretending otherwise. But in our data, and I don't know if we've reported this in any of our stuff, but I'm just going to tell you, and maybe this isn't exclusive for your audience, the one negative response that comes back from our surveys regarding JD Vance is phony. And you're almost a Midwesterner. I mean, you're kind of border Midwesterner. I grew up in Indiana. In the Midwest, we tend to prefer, genuine people. We tend to prefer, this is why the Midwest is a very different place than anywhere else in the country. It's a very down to earth. People are pretty normal. People are friendly. They know their neighbors. And the constant response that keeps coming back on JD Vance is phony. And when you compare that to a Tim Ryan, who isn't a extreme left wing, he's not Elizabeth Warren. He's much more of a blue dog, kind of an old school Joe Biden type, right? So the combination of the two things is what's giving you a fairly surprising result.
For the ones who know safety isn't a catchphrase, it's a culture. And the ones who help make sure everyone makes it home safe. For the safety-minded who watch everyone's backs, Grainger offers supplies and solutions for every industry, as well as safety assessments and training to keep your facilities safe and your people safer. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Yeah. Jacob Perry joining us. Real quick, two other races I want to ask you about while I got you on the line. You just mentioned it, so let's talk about Rubio. You got him up about 5 points. Again, just somebody that watches this and somewhat reads on, tries to keep up with it and talks to people. That felt right when I saw it. DeSantis is probably going to win his race, so there's going to be some flow over there. Rubio's his national brand's been damaged, but he's pretty still in the main line for a Florida senator with all things considered. Charlie Crist is going to be the first person in recorded human history to lose a race as a Republican, Democrat, and an independent. That's pretty amazing. But that feels right. You know Florida inside and out. You live there. Does that one feel like that's probably going to be about what it is? Maybe Demings might get a little surge depending, or she might fall off depending on how the economy and Biden and all that goes. But this kind of feels like what it's been all along and where it's going to end up.
The problem that Val is running into, Congresswoman Demings is running into, and I apologize. Sometimes it's, we're doing the constant conversations all day. There's shorthand that we use. Congresswoman Demings just doesn't have a very high name ID, and obviously Senator Rubio does, and so that's actually been the biggest. And our model is weighted towards favorability and name ID, right? Which is why sometimes we're a couple points ahead of everybody else. And what we've seen is consistently Congresswoman Demings' name ID and favorabilities have been relatively flat. There's been a couple of waves, if you will, but it's been relatively flat. And she was making some decent gains. And then, quite honestly, instead of telling her story, she started going negative. And voters have kind of mixed feelings about that stuff. And so instead of using that opportunity to tell her story, she's got a remarkable story. Went to a segregated elementary school, started out as a beat cop in Orlando, became police chief. Like, she has an incredible story, and she's not telling her story. And so because of that, that's allowed Senator Rubio, who has a pretty significant cash advantage, to define her instead of, it's the age old thing. She's not defining herself. He's defining her.
One more race I wanted to ask you about. Down in Georgia, Raphael Warnock, Senator Warnock, Herschel Walker. You got Warnock up a little bit. I've been on the island since last January of 2020 being like, no, y'all need to understand Warnock's going to be a really hard out because that race got really ugly and personal, and the national media didn't cover it because of all the Trump stuff. But that was an ugly, ugly race. The reason I wanted to ask about it is Herschel Walker, though. His numbers have actually started improving. We mentioned J.D. Vance. This is not my opinion. This is source. I've talked to multiple people about this. You've heard the exact same stories. J.D. Vance has absolutely refused to take any help from any wing. I'm talking conservative, moderate. The libertarians reached out to him. He's refusing anybody helping him, and his campaign's been a mess. All of a sudden, about 6 weeks ago now, Herschel Walker took outside help, and it's showing, and his numbers are getting better. I bring that up because that's going to be an important contest as he tries to tighten this up and tries to knock off Senator Raphael Warnock, and what's going to be a really close, hopefully it's not as ugly as 2020. We'll see. But that's the difference in the numbers there is Herschel, somebody got a hold of him and said, hey, you need some help. Let's get some folks in here.
Yes. And look, let's be honest, it's Georgia, right? And I'm sitting, 45 minutes from the Georgia state line. So I'm not exactly unfamiliar with Georgia and Georgia politics. I mean, this is the state that elected Marjorie Taylor Greene, right? So it is Georgia. Herschel Walker played for the University of Georgia. Was an incredible hero back in the early 80s in Georgia, still has remarkable name ID. Senator Warnock, if I have to be really honest, is probably a little too far on the left, or at least, we talked about Arizona, right? Senator Kelly has done an excellent job of being, let's call it left of center, right? Like relatively center, left of center, probably left on some things, but hasn't gone completely off the reservation. Senator Warnock has a much more liberal voting record. And again, it is Georgia, and it's Georgia. Right? Like, it's Georgia. I don't know.
And
It's like,
it's one of the reason you're saying it's Georgia is because you have Atlanta and you got everything else. And
correct.
Atlanta
That's
is
exactly right.
rapidly diversifying. It's rapidly going purple. It's one of
Yep.
the most dynamic cities in a
Yep.
lot of ways, and that's
Yep.
showing politically. And then you got everything else, which is the rural part of Georgia, which is still deep red country.
Yeah.
And then you
so
got this
here's a good
outlier of
example.
Herschel Walker, who's let's just call it what it is. He's a celebrity candidate with no background.
Yep.
And you have a very traditional, progressive, up through the ranks, ministerial background, social justice background, progressive.
Yep.
He's being authentic about it, by the way, which is why he doesn't
Yeah.
get dinged on it, because that is who he is.
Absolutely.
I mean, this is almost like a political class theory on how to do a race on a celebrity candidate and a well-grained one in a very rapidly changing state. And that's why I get exactly what you're saying, and the folks will too, when you're saying it's Georgia. Nobody's got a handle on what Georgia is right now if they're just honest about it.
No, and what is it? Is it Marietta County? That's the next north of Georgia, or of Atlanta, obviously Georgia.
Yeah, the Buckhead
where the Braves
City mess,
Stadium
all
is,
that.
and
Yeah,
yeah.
it's a mess.
Like that's becoming more purple. I mean, we actually tracked a couple of races in Georgia. We looked at playing in the MTG district, for example. I've spent a lot of time in Georgia over the past almost year now, I guess. You're exactly right. Like Senator Warnock has to carry Fulton County like by a landslide. Has to carry,
which he will, by the way.
Yeah, he will. But the time that I spent in northwest Georgia, Rome, kind of that area, which is where Marjorie Taylor Greene's district is, that is the lowest COVID vaccination percentage in the country, right? So, and that's 45 minutes north of Atlanta, northwest of Atlanta. So it is Georgia, and he is Herschel Walker. Like, if it was someone else, if it was Jeff Duncan, for example, the outgoing lieutenant governor, this would be a very different race. And I have a lot of respect for Lieutenant Governor Duncan. This would be a very different race, but it's kind of the same dynamic we have here locally in Tallahassee, where I'm at, where you have a candidate for state senate who played football at Florida State. Well,
5-10
unless they
points
find
right off the jump.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, unless they find the body of a 4-year-old girl in the back of his car, like, he's pretty much guaranteed election. And Georgia and Georgia football or whatever, whatever Herschel Walker has said, whatever crazy statements he's made, whatever, the more he keeps his mouth shut and the more he does private events that are off the record, whatever, he's probably going to win this thing by 4 to 6 points.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch either which way. Jacob Perry, appreciate the quick time. Get you back on here again. Let folks know what you've got going on here with Center Street Pack again. Again, y'all ain't biased. You're out here with doing what you're doing, but you do it well. Let folks know where they can find what you're doing and what you're doing. We're going to link to the polling, the actual polling, not just the tweets, because they do have their information at the bottom, which is always a sign of a good poll. Let folks know where they can follow you until we talk again.
No, I appreciate that. We share everything. We're very open about the data that we analyze, that we gather. It's at Center Street Pack on Twitter, centerstreetpack.com on the web. And then I am at Real Jacob Perry if you are predisposed to following somebody crazy on Twitter.
We bump heads on some things, we agree on other, but it's always entertaining, buddy. Especially
Absolutely.
during English soccer season and football over there, because that wall doesn't have it, but he does have some paraphernalia. We'll just leave it at that. Jacob, thanks for the time today, buddy. Appreciate it.
Thanks, brother. Thanks for having me on.
Sir.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.